In part 1 I started work on this battery damaged Contax 137 MA. It all took far more time than it should have done just to get the camera open and then disconnect enough parts to remove the mirror box along with the main PCB. I'll put a link to that video on screen about now and also down in the description. The project is clearly going to be a long haul, so I'll try to tackle it in bite-sized chunks. My aim for this video is to get the shutter out of the camera body. The spring drums are seized solid, as is all the winding mechanism. In fact, virtually everything that should move doesn't at the moment, so it'll all need stripping and cleaning to remove those dreaded alkaline battery deposits. There could be some logic in starting with the other half and looking at how much wiring I'm going to need to replace, but I'd still need the rest of the camera working to test the electronics, so I'll carry on as planned. And it would appear that in theory removing the shutter assembly on this camera is quite a simple task. There's a couple of solder connections beneath the stop-down lever, and then 4 screws on top. I've already pre-loosened these so they'll come out easily on camera. And now the whole assembly should just lift out, so here goes. And it seems to be catching on something, so I'll just take a look before I charge ahead. Okay, a whole lot of jiggling later and it's out. The culprit for it sticking was the rewind release button shaft here, which was so covered in battery deposits that it prevented it from passing through the top plate, so that probably wouldn't usually be a problem on another copy of this camera. At this stage I can take a look at a few of the potential problems that I've been worrying about. The shutter curtains themselves. You saw in part 1 how the alkaline battery deposits had rotted the fabric parts of the leatherette covering material. If the shutter cloth is similarly rotten, then they would need replacing. The same goes for the metal shutter nosings, but in both cases they appear to be in pretty good shape. They don't even appear to be particularly contaminated, which is handy because I'm not sure about soaking them in vinegar. The motor will almost inevitably be seized, and that could be a pain to free off. And last, but definitely not least, I've known some plastics to disintegrate when left sitting in alkaline battery electrolyte, and if that has happened to this set of gears in the bottom of the camera, it would hamper the project somewhat. I could get new gears made, but it wouldn't be cheap replacing that lot, so hopefully they'll clean up okay and not fall apart in the vinegar. Additionally, not so much a worry as a note to self to check how much clearance there is between the bottom of the shutter assembly and the camera chassis. I may need to order some extra thin wire to replace this rotten PCB at the bottom here. I'm thinking that the thicker tracks might be the motor tracks, and I might need to double up on my wires if that ends up as the route I go down. I could of course just redraw the PCB and get replacements made, but that would make this ridiculous project somewhat more ridiculous than it already is. Now the additional assemblies need to come off the shutter module. This section is part of the mirror activating mechanism, and it's held in place with 4 screws. One on top, one here and another up here, and a final one somewhere behind this lever. All the other screws on the camera have been more or less seized in place, but now all of a sudden I haven't got so much to hold on to, so it's going to be that bit more tricky to unscrew them. Not to mention that the lever here is also jammed solid, so more vinegar is called for before I can even attempt to move anything. Well, that's half an evening gone, but all 3 levers are now moving. I'll clean them properly once that unit is off, but the main thing is that I can now get to the screw behind the rear lever. Repeated soaking with vinegar to break up the battery corrosion, followed by IPA to flush out the residue, did the trick, all the time making sure I didn't get anything onto the shutter curtains. And that's the last screw out, leaving the mechanism free to come off, remembering that it has some pretty delicate electrical contacts on the back, which I'd rather not bend. And that's the same mechanism stripped apart, properly cleaned and re-lubricated on the pivots. There is an eccentric screw that fits here. It adjusts the closing position of the contacts on the reverse of the plate. I've already described its position before I took it apart, but it might well need some adjusting later on. While that lot was in the vinegar, I freed up the 4 screws that secure the bottom gear plate. 2 of the screws freed off easily, whereas the other 2 required vinegar, heat, more vinegar and more heat before they would move. Finally now that section can lift out, complete with the motor assembly. Or, as is always the case, it's putting up a bit of a fight. Aha, this brown wire needs to be unstuck from the upper section first. A bit more jiggling, and finally we're out. So now for the bad stuff. Obviously the motor is seized solid, I expected that, but if you look down at the bottom, this set of contacts are bubbling up under the gold plating. Once I've dunked them in vinegar, there will probably be nothing left at all. Fabricating a replacement will take me ages, and it wouldn't be gold plated either, so it won't be as reliable in its switching. I've already got to replace the wiper contacts on the shutter speed selector, another project that will take ages. Obviously I could raid another camera for parts, but dismantling a better example to save this wreck isn't my preferred method. A time machine would be handy, then I could just order spares from Contax, or Yashica, depending on how you look at it. Anyway, I'll persevere for the time being. I could do with removing those contacts before I work on the rest of this assembly, but the screw securing them is hidden beneath this lever, which is of course jammed solid. I'll pop a bit of vinegar on the pivot for the aperture stop-down lever in the hopes that I can free it up enough to access the screw securing the switch contacts. Just look at it fizz. Somehow that expression might be wearing a bit thin by now. Then sloosh away the residue with a few drops of IPA, and then repeat the process. But still it won't budge, so it's time for some heat from this old soldering iron. A small blowtorch would provide more heat, but there are parts that I don't want to get that hot, so I'll stick with the iron for now. While it's warming up, I can flush it with IPA and vinegar. The IPA tends to clear the way for the vinegar to penetrate better. Once it's hot enough, I'll try both the lever and the screw, and then apply more vinegar and start the process again. Once I'm fairly sure the vinegar has penetrated quite well, a drop of oil can often help because it becomes very thin from the heat, creeping its way into the joint. And we're moving. Next to free up the lower lever that's blocking my access to the screw for the switch contacts. Looking at that lower lever, it has an end stop here, so clearly the lever moves in this direction, at which point this spring-loaded section will move the mirror up gear by 1 tooth, or vice versa, as this slot is actually driven by the motor. But either way, I could do with freeing up both the mirror up gear, which appears to be plastic, and the pivot point for its lever here. So a bit of careful heat on the pivot. I don't want to melt the gear if it is indeed plastic, and I've already applied vinegar to the gear itself. And that's got the lever moving a little. It's still a bit sticky, but that won't take much freeing off now. As a bonus, most of the gears in this half of the assembly are now free. Finally, after more heat and more vinegar, the lower lever has moved a bit, so I can now remove the screw and examine what's left of the switch contacts. Or can I? It looks like it's pegged into the base, so I'll need to remove the levers above it before it will come out. But I can already see that all the green gunge back there is what's left of the rear contact, along with this section of plating that floated off with all the liquid earlier. I'm guessing that as the batteries leaked, they still had a little power in them, and some form of electrolysis has taken place, which would explain why one contact is more or less intact, whereas the other has completely vanished. And there it is. The moving contact was connected to ground via this mounting screw, and the entire contact has vanished, whereas the fixed contact is actually more or less intact. It's a shame that I haven't got a template to work from, because I'll just have to guess what the missing contact looked like. It's at times like this when I ask myself, why did I start this? Although I'd managed to move the lower lever, it turned out that the lever had become loose on its brass centre boss, the boss being very much seized to the axle. So much more heating, and vinegar, and heating, and IPA, and more vinegar later, and finally it's off. I'll need to recrimp it onto the boss before I reassemble the camera, but at least it's off. And while I'm at it, this is the exposure compensation mechanism from the top of the camera, which was also seized solid when I took it off. I've now managed to get the release pin out, so I just need to free off the rotating section and it'll be fixed. Finally, now I can put this away and forget about it for a week or two. I probably should have removed this earlier, but this component that I unsoldered is a photodiode located at the bottom of the mirror box beneath the aperture lever, so maybe I should remove it and clean it carefully now. Next, I can start removing the gears from the base plate. I've already freed off the seized screws, so it will look fairly effortless on the video footage. Needless to say, some vinegar and heat played its role in getting them moving. The two idler gears are riveted in place, so those will be cleaned in situ. To remove the nylon gear with the cam on it, I'll need to remove the C-clip, which I'll do off camera to avoid the inevitable occurrence of it transforming into a trans-dimensional being never to be seen again. But also this lever needs to move out of the way, and as usual it's jammed solid, so it's back to the usual vinegar and heat and oil to get it moving again. As always, that took a long time, and I've only managed to free the lever enough to move it out of the way, only to notice the blooming obvious in that I need to remove the motor gearbox before I can lift the gear out. So there are two screws securing the motor, which is probably the first thing on this camera that's come off easily, and three screws securing the gearbox top plate, all of which required freeing off before they would move. My prediction now is that the top plate won't come off without putting up a fight. And on this occasion I was wrong. Things are looking up. So now I can hopefully pick out these gears. I've already noted their orientation and locations, so hopefully they'll be easy to refit when the time comes. Also, on a first glance, they're looking okay condition-wise too, which is a bit of a bonus. And with that, I'm going to end this episode. The gearbox chassis can go in the vinegar for a while to break down the alkaline deposits, and I'll clean up the gears off camera. I'll try to get another bite-sized chunk done soon, although these little bite-sized videos are more like a 10-course meal in the time that they take to create, so I probably won't manage to do one every week. If you've enjoyed watching, please like the video and maybe even subscribe to the channel so you get notifications when the next episode is released. That's it for now, so thanks for watching and I'll see you in a future video.